Before motion pictures existed, entertainment was almost entirely live and local. People gathered in shared physical spaces to watch performances that unfolded in real time. Theatre was one of the most common forms, ranging from large, formal productions to small traveling shows that moved between towns. Music, dance, poetry, and oral storytelling were central to social and cultural life. Performances took place in theatres, town halls, churches, open squares, and temporary stages. Because these events were live, they were also temporary. Once a performance ended, it existed only in memory and retelling. This impermanence shaped how audiences experienced entertainment, emphasizing presence and shared experience. Long before film, humans were fascinated by the idea of creating moving images. Across many cultures, visual illusions were used to suggest motion or transformation. Shadow plays, for example, used light and simple shapes to create the appearance of movement on walls or screens. These performances relied on imagination as much as technique. This curiosity reflected a deeper interest in how the human eye and brain interpret motion. People noticed that rapidly changing images could appear continuous. This observation would later become central to motion picture technology. During the 18th and 19th centuries, inventors created mechanical devices that demonstrated visual illusion. The thaumatrope used two images on opposite sides of a spinning disc, which appeared to merge when rotated quickly. The phenakistoscope and zoetrope used sequences of images viewed through slits, creating the illusion of movement. These devices were often used as toys or scientific demonstrations. They did not record real movement, but they revealed how motion could be simulated. Each experiment added to a growing understanding of visual perception. The invention of photography marked a major turning point. For the first time, images of the real world could be captured and preserved. Light-sensitive materials allowed scenes, people, and landscapes to be recorded with accuracy. Photography changed how reality was documented. Instead of relying on drawings or written descriptions, images could now be reproduced and shared. This created new possibilities for studying movement, time, and everyday life. As photographic technology improved, some photographers began experimenting with sequences of images. By taking multiple photographs in rapid succession, they captured stages of movement that could not be seen clearly by the human eye alone. These experiments showed that motion could be broken down into individual frames. When viewed in sequence, these frames suggested continuous movement. This idea became one of the fundamental principles of cinema. By the late 19th century, inventors sought ways to project sequences of images onto screens. Film strips were developed that could move quickly through cameras and projectors. Mechanical systems synchronized image movement with light sources. These early systems were fragile and required precise handling. Despite technical challenges, they demonstrated that moving images could be shown to groups of people, not just individual viewers. Celluloid film made it possible to record long sequences of images on a flexible strip. Each frame captured a moment in time. When the strip passed rapidly through a projector, these frames appeared to move. This process transformed earlier optical illusions into recorded motion. For the first time, events could be replayed exactly as they occurred. This capability distinguished film from all previous forms of visual entertainment. Early public film screenings were brief. Many films lasted less than a minute, and depicted simple scenes from everyday life. Audiences watched trains arriving at stations, people walking down streets, or workers leaving factories. These images were familiar, yet seeing them move on a screen was remarkable. Viewers were often surprised by the realism of motion, even when the content itself was ordinary. At first, film was treated as a novelty rather than an art form. It was presented alongside magic shows, vaudeville acts, and scientific exhibitions. The moving image was valued for its technical novelty rather than narrative depth. Film screenings were short and informal. There was little distinction between entertainment and demonstration. This period was defined by experimentation rather than established rules. Gradually, filmmakers began using motion pictures to tell simple stories. Scenes were staged deliberately. Actors performed roles rather than appearing incidentally. Editing techniques were developed to connect shots and suggest continuity. As films became longer, audiences grew accustomed to following narratives. This shift marked an important transition from novelty to storytelling medium. Early film production was concentrated in large cities where technology, labor, and audiences were available. New York and Chicago became early hubs in the United States, while Paris and London played major roles in Europe. Studios were small and often temporary. Equipment was moved frequently. Production methods were informal, and experimentation was constant. Early filmmaking faced many constraints. Cameras were heavy and difficult to move. Film stock was sensitive to light and temperature. Artificial lighting was limited and unreliable. As a result, many films were shot outdoors using natural sunlight. This dependence on weather influenced where and how films could be made. Filmmakers began seeking locations with consistent sunlight and predictable weather. Open spaces allowed for easier camera placement and lighting. Lower costs and fewer restrictions were also attractive. These practical concerns gradually pushed film production away from dense urban centers. The search for reliable conditions would shape the geography of the emerging industry. At this stage, Hollywood was not associated with filmmaking. It was a small agricultural community in Southern California. The area was known for orchards, ranches, and open land. There were no studios, no permanent film infrastructure, and no cultural connection to cinema. Hollywood had not yet entered public awareness. Early filmmaking did not resemble a modern industry. Individuals often handled multiple roles, including writing, directing, and operating cameras. Budgets were small, and production schedules were flexible. There were few established standards. Techniques evolved through trial and error rather than formal training. By the early 20th century, the essential components of cinema existed. Cameras could record motion. Film stock could preserve it. Projectors could display it to audiences. Narrative techniques were developing, and public interest was growing. What remained was the organization and scale that would define a true industry. Film began to shift from temporary novelty to regular entertainment. Dedicated venues appeared, charging admission for screenings. Nickelodeons offered short programs of films to paying audiences. Regular attendance created demand for more content. Production increased to meet this demand. Modern Hollywood developed from these early conditions. The technology preceded the industry. Experimentation came before standardization. Understanding this period explains why later developments unfolded as they did. Hollywood was not inevitable. It emerged from practical decisions, technological limits, and audience curiosity. In the earliest years of motion pictures, most American film production took place on the East Coast. Cities such as New York, New Jersey, and Chicago were centers of technology, finance, and population. Film equipment manufacturers, theater owners, and early studios were concentrated in these regions. New Jersey, in particular, became an important hub. Towns such as Fort Lee hosted many early studios. Proximity to New York provided access to talent, investors, and audiences. At this stage, there was no single dominant location for filmmaking. Early film technology relied heavily on sunlight. Film stock was slow and required strong illumination. Artificial lighting was limited, expensive, and unreliable. As a result, filmmakers preferred to shoot outdoors or in studios with glass roofs. Weather therefore became a significant factor. Cloudy skies, rain, and short winter days reduced filming time. In northern regions, production was often interrupted for long periods during colder months. Southern California offered a clear advantage. The region experienced many sunny days each year. Rain was infrequent. Winters were mild. Filmmakers could work outdoors for most of the year without interruption. This reliable climate allowed for consistent production schedules. Fewer delays meant lower costs and greater efficiency. Over time, these advantages became increasingly important as film production expanded. Southern California also offered remarkable geographic diversity within a relatively small area. Filmmakers could access beaches, deserts, mountains, farmland, forests, and urban streets without traveling long distances. This variety allowed the same region to represent many different locations on screen. Western landscapes, European villages, tropical settings, and rural farmland could all be simulated nearby. This reduced travel expenses and simplified logistics. At the beginning of the 20th century, Southern California had large amounts of inexpensive land. Open spaces were readily available for studio construction. Filmmakers could build large sets and permanent facilities without the high costs associated with eastern cities. This availability supported long-term investment. Studios could expand gradually, adding stages, workshops, and storage areas as production needs increased. Another factor influencing the move west was distance. The film industry was still new, and many of its practices were unregulated. Operating far from established business centers allowed filmmakers greater freedom. This distance reduced interference from existing theatrical organizations and local authorities. It also provided a degree of independence during a period of rapid experimentation. In the early film industry, patents played a significant role. Thomas Edison and associated companies controlled many key patents related to motion picture cameras and projectors. These patent holders aggressively enforced their claims. Lawsuits and licensing fees created difficulties for independent filmmakers on the East Coast. Legal pressure increased costs and uncertainty. Some filmmakers moved west in part to reduce exposure to patent enforcement. Distance made it more difficult for patent agents to monitor production and pursue legal action. While this was not the sole reason for relocation, it contributed to the appeal of California. Greater physical distance offered a degree of operational flexibility during the industry's formative years. Despite being geographically distant from eastern cities, Southern California was becoming more accessible. Railroads connected Los Angeles to the rest of the country. Equipment, film stock, and personnel could be transported efficiently. Ports also allowed access to international shipping routes. This supported distribution and trade as the industry grew. Los Angeles itself was growing rapidly. Population increased. Infrastructure expanded. Housing and services developed to support new industries. The city welcomed investment and offered favorable business conditions. Local governments were often cooperative, viewing film production as an economic opportunity. Small production companies began relocating parts of their operations to Southern California. At first, these moves were temporary. Crews traveled west for specific shoots, then returned east. Over time, these temporary arrangements became permanent. Studios realized the long-term benefits of remaining in one location. By the 1910s, permanent studios were being constructed in and around Hollywood. Facilities included stages, editing rooms, and administrative offices. As infrastructure developed, skilled workers followed. A local workforce formed. Supporting industries emerged alongside filmmaking. The move to Hollywood did not happen overnight. It occurred gradually over many years. Different companies relocated at different times for different reasons. Eventually, the concentration of studios created momentum. Hollywood became the center of American film production because other filmmakers were already there. Hollywood offered a combination of climate, geography, space, labor, and infrastructure. No single factor explains the shift. Together, these conditions created an environment well suited to large-scale film production. Once established, the location reinforced itself. Talent moved where opportunities existed. Investment followed production. The relocation to Hollywood shaped the future of cinema. Studio systems developed. Production became centralized. A distinct film culture emerged. What began as a practical decision eventually defined an entire industry. During the early decades of cinema, films did not include synchronized recorded sound. Dialogue, music, and sound effects were not embedded in the film itself. Instead, motion pictures relied entirely on visual storytelling. Audiences understood stories through movement, facial expression, staging, and editing. This limitation shaped how films were written, performed, and directed. Although films were silent in recording, screenings were rarely silent in practice. Most theaters employed live musicians. Pianists, organists, or small orchestras accompanied screenings. Music helped establish mood and pacing. In larger theaters, cue sheets suggested appropriate musical themes. Sound effects were sometimes produced live. Each screening could sound slightly different. To convey dialogue and narrative information, silent films used intertitles. These were text cards inserted between shots. Intertitles explained plot points, translated dialogue, or provided context. Their placement and wording were carefully chosen to support the visual flow without interrupting it excessively. Silent film acting relied on physical expression. Performers used gestures, posture, and facial movement to communicate emotion. Early acting styles were often exaggerated, influenced by stage performance. Over time, Acting became more naturalistic as filmmakers learned how subtle movements appeared on camera. The silent era was a period of rapid experimentation. Filmmakers developed techniques that remain fundamental to cinema. These included close-ups, cross-cutting, establishing shots, and continuity editing. Visual composition became increasingly sophisticated. Audiences learned how to interpret cinematic language. Editing allowed filmmakers to control time and space. Scenes could be shortened, expanded, or rearranged. Parallel action showed events happening simultaneously. Flashbacks provided context. These techniques made complex storytelling possible without spoken words. Early films were short, often only a few minutes long. During the silent era, films gradually increased in length. Feature-length films became common. Longer narratives allowed deeper character development and more elaborate plots. Audiences responded positively to extended stories. As production increased, filmmaking became more organized. Studios developed permanent facilities. Departments specialized in writing, directing, cinematography, set construction, and costume design. This division of labor improved efficiency and output. During the silent era, recognizable genres formed. Comedy, drama, romance, adventure, and historical epics became established categories. Audiences developed expectations. Studios learned which types of films attracted consistent viewers. Silent comedy relied heavily on physical humor. Slapstick comedy used exaggerated action, timing, and visual gags. Comedians became widely recognized figures. Their films were popular internationally because they required little translation. Because silent films did not rely on spoken language, they traveled easily across borders. Intertitles could be replaced with translated versions. This made cinema a global form of entertainment. Hollywood films reached Europe, Asia, and beyond. International stars emerged. As audiences returned to see familiar performers, studios recognized the value of individual stars. Actors' names were promoted. Public interest in their lives increased. Fan magazines appeared. This marked the beginning of the star system, which would later dominate Hollywood culture. During this period, directors began to be recognized as creative leaders. Their stylistic choices became identifiable. Some directors gained reputations for visual innovation or large-scale productions. The idea of the director as an artist emerged gradually. Silent cinema produced ambitious films. Historical epics required large sets, costumes, and extras. These productions demonstrated cinema's ability to create spectacle. They also required significant investment and coordination. Silent filmmaking faced limitations. Cameras were hand-cranked. Film stock was sensitive. Lighting required careful planning. Despite these challenges, filmmakers adapted. Techniques improved through experience rather than formal instruction. Moviegoing became a regular activity. Dedicated cinemas replaced temporary venues. Audiences attended weekly or even daily. Film became part of everyday life in many cities. Silent films influenced fashion, behavior, and popular culture. Visual styles spread through cinema. Stories reflected social values and concerns of the time. Film became a powerful cultural force. Despite its success, silent cinema had limitations. Dialogue required text. Music varied by venue. Synchronization was imperfect. Inventors continued searching for ways to combine sound and image reliably. The silent era was nearing its end. A major transformation was approaching. As film production expanded during the silent era, informal methods became insufficient. Studios were producing more films, employing more workers, and serving larger audiences. Coordination became necessary. This pressure led to structured systems that could manage complexity. Film production began to resemble industrial manufacturing rather than small-scale craftsmanship. The defining feature of the studio system was vertical integration. Major studios controlled multiple stages of the filmmaking process. They produced films. They distributed films. They owned theaters where films were shown. This structure allowed studios to control what was made, how it was marketed, and where it was exhibited. By the 1920s and 1930s, a small number of companies dominated Hollywood. These studios included Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO. Each studio operated like a self-contained world. Large studio lots housed stages, offices, workshops, and backlots. Films were produced using an assembly line approach. Writers developed scripts. Directors supervised filming. Cinematographers handled cameras. Editors assembled footage. Each role was specialized. Workers focused on specific tasks. This system allowed studios to produce films efficiently and consistently. Actors were employed under long-term contracts. Studios controlled casting, salaries, and public image. Actors were assigned roles according to studio needs. Career paths were managed internally. Public appearances and publicity were carefully coordinated. Studios crafted star personas. Names, appearances, and personal histories were sometimes altered for public appeal. Fan magazines reinforced these images. The goal was consistency and audience loyalty. Directors were employees rather than independent artists. Studios assigned projects and schedules. Creative freedom varied. Some directors gained influence over time. Others worked within strict guidelines. The system prioritized efficiency and reliability over individual expression. Studios developed strengths in particular genres. Some focused on musicals, others on westerns, crime films, or romantic dramas. This specialization streamlined production. Sets, costumes, and expertise could be reused. Films were planned according to detailed schedules. Shooting timelines were tightly controlled. Budgets were monitored carefully. Delays increased costs. Efficiency was valued. Studios controlled national and international distribution networks. Films were released in patterns that maximized profit. Theaters owned by studios guaranteed screening space. Independent theaters often had limited choice. One common practice was block booking. Theater owners were required to purchase groups of films rather than selecting individual titles. This ensured wide distribution for all studio productions, regardless of quality or popularity. The studio system produced a high volume of films. Many were technically polished. At the same time, creative risk was limited. studios favored proven formulas. Innovation occurred gradually. Studio lots employed thousands of workers: carpenters, costume designers, electricians, editors, and assistants worked under strict hierarchies. Labor unions eventually formed to protect working conditions. The studio system created financial predictability. Profits from successful films supported less popular projects. This stability allowed long-term planning and expansion. Studio films shaped popular culture. Fashion, speech patterns, and social ideals spread through cinema. Hollywood became a dominant cultural force. The concentration of power drew criticism. Independent filmmakers faced barriers. Competition was limited. These concerns would later lead to legal challenges. By the mid-20th century, social, legal, and technological pressures began to weaken the studio system. The system remained influential, but its dominance would eventually decline. By the late 1920s, silent cinema had reached a high level of sophistication. Visual storytelling techniques were well developed, and audiences were accustomed to complex narratives conveyed without spoken dialogue. Despite this success, limitations remained. Dialogue required text cards. Music varied by theater. Sound effects were inconsistent. Filmmakers and inventors continued searching for ways to synchronize sound with moving images in a reliable and repeatable way. Experiments combining sound and image began almost as soon as motion pictures appeared. Early systems attempted to synchronize phonograph recordings with film projection. These systems were mechanically complex and often unreliable. Synchronization drifted. Sound quality was poor. For many years, sound remained a technical challenge rather than a practical solution. In the mid-1920s, advances in electrical recording and amplification made synchronized sound more feasible. New systems allowed sound to be recorded directly onto film or played back in precise alignment. This technological improvement marked a turning point. Sound could now be reproduced consistently across theaters. When the first successful sound films reached audiences, the response was immediate. Hearing voices emerge from the screen changed the viewing experience. Dialogue, accents, and vocal performance added new dimensions to storytelling. Silent cinema's dominance ended rapidly once sound proved commercially viable. The shift to sound required major changes. Studios invested in new equipment. Soundproof stages were constructed. Cameras were enclosed to reduce noise. Production slowed during the transition. Techniques had to be relearned. Entire workflows were redesigned. Sound altered acting styles. Performers now needed clear speech and controlled vocal delivery. Accents and voices became important. Some silent film stars struggled to adapt. Others found new success. Casting priorities changed, reshaping careers. Early sound films restricted camera movement. Microphones were stationary and sensitive. Dialogue scenes were staged carefully to accommodate recording limits. Over time, technology improved. Filmmakers gradually regained visual freedom while incorporating sound more naturally. Sound enabled new forms of cinema. Musicals became popular. Dialogue-driven comedies and dramas expanded. Music and spoken word allowed more subtle emotional expression. Genre diversity increased. Sound complicated international distribution. language barriers emerged. Silent films had been easily translated using intertitles. Studios experimented with multiple language versions and dubbing. Global distribution strategies evolved. Color film was explored alongside sound. Early color processes added limited hues rather than full color. These systems were expensive and technically demanding. Color was initially used for special scenes rather than entire films. Over time, color technology improved. New processes allowed richer and more stable color reproduction. Studios began producing full-color films. Color added visual spectacle and became associated with prestige productions. Color affected set design, costume choice, and lighting. Production planning became more complex. Studios weighed cost against appeal. Color was used selectively before becoming widespread. Audiences adapted quickly. Sound and color became expected features of mainstream cinema. Silent films disappeared from major theaters. Black and white remained common, but gradually lost dominance. Sound and color required significant capital. Large studios were best positioned to invest. This reinforced studio dominance and increased barriers for independent producers. Technological change reshaped Hollywood's creative and economic structure. New skills were required. New professions emerged. Cinema became more immersive and standardized. Sound and color did not end innovation. They marked one stage in an ongoing process of technological change. Future developments would continue to alter how films were made and experienced. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the studio system had reached its most stable form. Major studios controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. Film output was consistent. Audiences were large and regular. Moviegoing was a routine part of weekly life. At this point, the system appeared durable. Its structure had supported profitability for decades, and few inside the industry expected fundamental change. Despite its success, the concentration of power within the studio system attracted attention from regulators. Vertical integration limited competition. Independent producers and theater owners faced restricted access to screens. Concerns centered on whether studios were unfairly controlling the marketplace. These concerns gradually moved from public debate into legal action. The United States government pursued antitrust cases against major studios. These cases argued that studio ownership of theaters and practices, such as block booking, violated competition laws. Legal proceedings developed slowly. Studios resisted changes and defended existing practices. The issue remained unresolved for years. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled against the major studios in what became known as the Paramount Decision. The ruling required studios to divest their theater chains and end certain distribution practices. This decision struck at the foundation of the studio system. Without guaranteed exhibition, studios lost control over how and where their films were shown. The loss of theater ownership disrupted financial planning. Studios could no longer rely on steady exhibition revenue. Film production slowed. Fewer films were made each year. Risk increased. Long-term contracts became less common. The traditional contract system weakened. Actors were no longer bound to single studios for extended periods. Freelance work increased. Performers gained more control over role selection and career direction. Power gradually shifted away from studios. Without guaranteed distribution, large-scale assembly line production became less efficient. Studios reduced permanent staff. Departments were downsized. Some facilities closed. Production became more project-based rather than continuous. Independent producers gained opportunities. Films could be financed outside the studio system and then distributed through various channels. This change diversified the types of films being made. Creative control was no longer concentrated in a few companies. Television emerged as a major competing medium in the late 1940s and 1950s. Audiences could now access entertainment at home. Movie theater attendance declined. Weekly habits changed. The film industry faced direct competition for attention. Studios initially viewed television as a threat. Some resisted cooperation. Eventually, studios adapted by emphasizing spectacle. Larger screens, widescreen formats, and epic productions were promoted as experiences television could not replicate. Rising production costs combined with declining attendance increased financial risk. Studios became more selective. Fewer films were produced, but budgets for individual projects often increased. The industry became less predictable. Audience composition changed. Younger viewers sought different types of stories. Social values evolved. Traditional studio formulas appealed less strongly. Filmmakers began exploring new themes and perspectives. As legal, economic, and cultural pressures accumulated, centralized studio control weakened. Authority became dispersed among producers, directors, and talent agencies. The studio system no longer defined the industry in the same way. The decline of the studio system was not immediate. Elements persisted for years. Some studios adapted more successfully than others. The transition unfolded over decades rather than months. The end of the studio system reshaped Hollywood. Employment structures changed. Creative relationships shifted. This period laid the groundwork for new forms of filmmaking that would follow. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, American society was undergoing significant change. Social norms were shifting. Younger generations questioned authority, tradition, and established institutions. These changes influenced audience expectations. Traditional Hollywood narratives felt increasingly distant from contemporary experience. Filmmakers faced pressure to reflect a changing world. The formulas that had defined studio-era cinema became less reliable. Genres that once guaranteed audiences no longer performed consistently. Studios struggled to predict success. Familiar stars and conventional stories did not always connect with younger viewers. This uncertainty created space for experimentation. During this period, American filmmakers were increasingly exposed to international films. European movements such as Italian neorealism and the French New Wave demonstrated alternative approaches to storytelling. These films emphasized realism, personal expression, and unconventional narrative structure. Their influence encouraged American directors to explore new styles. As studios reduced centralized control, directors gained greater influence over creative decisions. The idea of the director as the primary creative voice gained acceptance. This perspective, sometimes called auteur theory, emphasized personal vision. Directors began shaping tone, theme and visual style more distinctly. Films from this era often focused on character psychology rather than plot. Endings were sometimes ambiguous. Moral certainty was less common. Stories explored alienation, conflict, and uncertainty. These themes reflected broader cultural tensions. Budgets varied widely. Some films were produced with modest resources, allowing greater creative freedom. Others combined artistic ambition with commercial aims. Studios increasingly financed projects developed by individual filmmakers, rather than generating ideas internally. Studios acted more as financiers and distributors than strict supervisors. Creative control shifted toward directors, writers, and producers. This relationship was sometimes unstable. Success granted freedom. Failure could quickly end careers. Many films of the new Hollywood era resonated strongly with younger audiences. These viewers recognized their experiences and concerns on screen. At the same time, older audiences were sometimes less receptive. The industry became more segmented. Filmmakers experimented with handheld cameras, natural lighting, and location shooting. Editing styles became looser and more expressive. These techniques contributed to a sense of immediacy and realism. Topics previously avoided became more common. Films addressed social conflict, political uncertainty, and personal disillusionment. Censorship standards relaxed. Content expanded gradually rather than abruptly. This era produced both major successes and notable failures. Some films achieved critical and commercial recognition. Others struggled financially. The unpredictability of outcomes defined the period. Although creative freedom increased, it was not unlimited. Studios remained concerned with profitability. As budgets grew, tolerance for risk declined. The balance between art and commerce remained unstable. By the late 1970s, the conditions that enabled New Hollywood began to change. Audience preferences evolved again. Large-scale commercial strategies began to reassert influence. The director era left a lasting impact on filmmaking. Narrative complexity increased. Visual style diversified. Many techniques developed during this period became standard practice. By the late 1970s, Hollywood began moving toward a new production model. Studios sought greater financial stability after years of unpredictable results. Large-scale films with broad appeal became increasingly attractive. These films were designed to reach wide audiences quickly. High budgets were paired with extensive marketing. Financial success depended on strong initial attendance rather than gradual long-term runs. Wide theatrical releases became common. Films opened simultaneously in many locations rather than expanding slowly. This approach concentrated audience attention and revenue into a short time frame. Opening weekends gained importance as indicators of success. Studios recognized the value of recognizable properties. Sequels, recurring characters, and shared fictional worlds became common. Franchises reduced financial risk by building on existing audience familiarity. Long-term planning replaced one-off storytelling. Advertising budgets increased significantly. Television, print media, and later digital platforms played central roles in promotion. Film releases became coordinated cultural events. Marketing shaped audience expectations before films reached theaters. Advances in special effects expanded visual possibilities. Computer-generated imagery allowed scenes that were previously impractical or impossible. Digital tools changed production workflows. Editing, sound design, and visual effects became increasingly integrated. Film stock gradually gave way to digital recording and projection. Digital cameras reduced costs and increased flexibility. Post-production processes accelerated. Distribution became more efficient. Physical film prints became less common. Hollywood increasingly targeted international audiences. Global box office revenue became essential to financial success. Films were designed to translate across cultures. Visual spectacle and universal themes were emphasized. Productions often involved international financing, locations, and talent. Co-productions became common. Hollywood's influence expanded, while also absorbing global creative input. Home entertainment options expanded. Video rental, home media, and later streaming altered viewing habits. Audiences gained control over when and how they watched films. The exclusivity of theatrical viewing diminished. Streaming services introduced new distribution models. Films could be released directly to home audiences. This challenged traditional theatrical windows. Studios reassessed release strategies and revenue structures. Budgets diversified. Some projects became larger and more expensive. Others were produced for niche audiences. Creative opportunities expanded alongside financial pressures. Audience data increasingly influenced decisions. Viewing patterns informed development and marketing. This data-driven approach reshaped risk assessment and content strategy. Production became more project-based. Long-term employment declined. Freelance work increased. Unions adapted to changing conditions. Despite technological shifts, many traditional practices remained. Storytelling fundamentals persisted. Hollywood continued balancing commerce and creativity. Films remained influential in shaping global culture. Characters, imagery, and narratives circulated widely. Hollywood's role evolved, but did not disappear. The modern age of Hollywood is not fixed. Technology continues to change. Audience expectations continue to shift. The industry remains in motion, adapting to new conditions.